So Jack, having produced Bruce Dickinson's solo record Skunkworks, what was it like working with him in the studio? How did he approach recording vocals?
He has very good control. I mean, you put a mic on him and you immediately just push your chair back and go, there it is. There's the voice. I've heard this voice on so many records. It's not like you have to work to get the sound. The sound just comes out and there it is. I mean, it's like what they say about guitar players. You give them a different guitar and it still sounds like the same player. It's in the fingers. And it's the same way with Bruce. I mean, you could put a SM58 on him and it would probably, you'd still immediately know this is Bruce Dickinson. You just put a mic in front of him and let him rip. I mean, he's fucking Bruce Dickinson. He's got the voice. As soon as I put the 87 on him, and I'm not a big fan of the Neumann U87. I think the mic is a little nasal and it doesn't work with most singers that I use it on. It tends to sound a little strident, but he said that's the one that Martin Birch used on him. And I said, well, it's good enough for Martin Birch. It's good enough for me. Now, it must be said that the guy who produced most of the classic Iron Maiden records, his name is Martin Birch. And I think we just lost him a year or two ago, which was sort of tragic because I was as a record producer myself, I'm a big fan of those who have gone before me. I still remember the first time I got into the studio and it was time to record his vocals. And, we put him on a U87, which is what he told me was the mic for him. And, he started singing and I just looked at my assistant and went, there it is. There it is. There's the voice. Here it is right now, So, Bruce is definitely one of a kind.
What was Bruce Dickinson's work ethic like?
Very easy. I didn't have any problem working with him at all. I mean, it was like working with any other singer. The nice thing is, I mean, the really good singers are in a way the hardest to record because they set the bar very high for themselves. And they're literally doing stuff that's not easy to sing because they can do it. But that doesn't mean they do it in one take. You have to record multiple takes of this or that because they're trying to do this thing with their voice that they know they can do because that's what they do. But it's not a one-take thing. You got to have a few takes of it. And in 1995, we didn't have auto-tune. I wasn't doing it with Pro Tools. We were doing the whole thing on 2-inch tape. So, if something was out of tune, we had to punch it in and record it again. So, I mean, there were a lot of takes, where I would, this is the funny thing when you work with a new singer for the first time, there's always there's a period of getting to know each other in the on opposite sides of the glass. Okay, I'm in here, I've got the talk back, I'm the one going, do I tell him to do it again? Or is this as good as he's going to be able to do it? If I tell him to do it again, we're going to have to erase the one that he just did. This is a judgment call when you're going on 2-inch tape. It's like, do we erase the take we just did in the thought that hopefully he's going to get a better take, or do we settle? And in order to be able to judge that, you have to work with a singer for a little while to figure out what their capabilities are. What's their range? What's their quality level? How high is the bar for what this guy is going to accomplish? Once after, maybe after an afternoon of recording Bruce, I kind of got it. And I was like, all right, now I know how far I can push him without making him grouchy. And he's a very patient man. I mean, he's used to doing this. I mean, he's made enough records that he's not a diva. He's not going to stomp out of the room if you ask for a couple more takes. His attitude was very, very workmanlike, like we're here to make a record and tell me what you need. So, once I sort of got my rhythm of working with him and punching in the vocals and getting the takes, it worked out pretty well. And, we got the takes we needed. And, it's Bruce. He knows how to sing. It's not like I'm dealing with somebody that's like some sort of rescue operation where I have to like somehow make it sound good. It's like, no, I mean, he opens his mouth and the voice is there. You just have like, it's like, well, the timing here, your pitch there could be a little better. Your delivery there feels a little rushed. I mean, it's just the usual aesthetic choices that you make when you're recording vocals with somebody. Is this, you're looking for the one that makes me jump out of my chair and go, yes, that's the take. And he's like, yeah, I kind of thought that was the take. And I was like, that's totally the take. Let's move on. You know what I mean? When you get to that point, then you're like, good. And then sometimes it doesn't always work that well. Sometimes you got to work at it, and you're just, at the end of the day, you're like, did we get it? You know, I think we got it. That was really hard. And then the next day you listen to it and you're like, oh, this is great. Let's move on. It's a delight working with somebody who's professional and knows what they can do and what they're capable of and what they're not. I mean, if he wasn't feeling it on a given day, sometimes we would just skip it and I would go to guitar. You know, it'd be a few takes. He'd be like, yeah, I'm just, today's not going to work. And I'd be like, okay, well, we'll do overdubs. So we didn't force anything. And we had enough time in the studio. I mean, I had several weeks to make this record, which is enough time. I wasn't that familiar with Bruce's solo material. We just approached it fresh. I was like, oh, I've got this great singer here. He's got a band. They've got some riffs. And I just approached it like any other record I would do, except that I had more time and more money to work with, and a better studio situation than I was accustomed to working with here in Seattle, and a management company that pretty much fed me all the rope I needed to hang myself, really.
So after producing Bruce Dickinson's solo record in 1995, when was the next time you saw him?
2 or 3 years after I made the record, he actually came through the Seattle area doing a solo tour. This was before he rejoined Iron Maiden. This is the irony. He ended up inviting Adrian Smith to join his band later. Now, Adrian Smith was one of the other Iron Maiden guitar players who had left Iron Maiden shortly after Bruce Dickinson left Iron Maiden. So he ends up playing in Bruce Dickinson's band, and then Bruce Dickinson makes a couple of records that at the time sounded more like Iron Maiden than the Iron Maiden records that were coming out then with Blaze Bayley on vocals, actually. I could sort of see where this was going, and sure enough, a couple years later, Bruce is back in Iron Maiden, and they're playing stadiums again. Now, this is a funny story because around the same time, Iron Maiden came to Seattle with Blaze Bayley on vocals. And again, I was like, I think I need to see this. Now, in 1984, I saw Iron Maiden play at a stadium here in Seattle. It was the Peace of Mind tour. It was huge. It was Iron Maiden, Saxon, and Fastway. It was one of the last, giant concerts that I went to before I became embedded in the music scene and playing in bands and making records. So Iron Maiden comes through Seattle and they're playing a club show. And it was in the late 90s and they had Blaze Bayley on vocals. And it's a club show. It's a club here in Seattle where,
Really?
I've played shows at this club. It only holds like 300 people.
I'm very surprised to hear that.
They weren't playing stadiums. I mean, in the U.S., they were off there. I mean, I don't think they were even on EMI anymore at that point. Possibly Sanctuary themselves were putting out the records. I'm not quite clear on that. I'd have to go back and look. But they came through town and they played at a club. And, again, I called up Sanctuary in London. I was like, can I get on the guest list for this? And, Merck put me on the list. And, I got to show up at the club and say, hey, I'm on the guest list for this. And they're like, sure you are, buddy. And like, oh, you are? Okay. So I get in and it's crazy packed. It was so far over capacity. It was way beyond legal capacity. It was elbow to elbow. And they had a giant semi-truck parked in front of this club, with all this gear crammed into this little club. It was insane. And I saw like about half an hour of the show and then I just had to leave. It was way too many people in a tiny club. So fast forward a couple years, Bruce is back in the band and Iron Maiden is playing at the Tacoma Dome, which is this freaking humongous, giant covered stadium here again.
Yeah.
And I'm like, all right, I see where this this is where this had to go, So, Maiden is back on top and, they don't do clubs anymore. But neither does Bruce, So I got to see both of them playing in clubs during the wilderness years, if you will.
That's crazy. I actually did an interview with Blaze Bayley about 2.5 years ago. What was really interesting was when I was talking to him, I was going to ask him about Maiden at one point, but cool enough, he actually brought it up himself. And he mentioned that he was surprised when he got the word he was no longer in the band.
You know what? I thought he sounded pretty good on the Paul Di'Anno tunes. He was great. You know what I mean? When they did the old stuff, the Paul Di'Anno tunes, he was nailed. And then, but when he tried to do the Bruce Dickinson stuff, it wasn't quite as convincing, you know what I mean? Because he doesn't have that range. So, I was like, okay, I see why they got this guy. He's more like Paul Di'Anno. But anyway, it is what it is,
So Jack, when you were producing this Bruce Dickinson solo record in 1995, did Bruce ever talk to you about why he left Iron Maiden?
To hear Bruce tell it, he just wanted some more. I think he felt like, he wanted a little more freedom to do stuff. And, maybe he was just a little burned out on it. I mean, at that point, when he left Iron Maiden, it had been like, what, over a decade, maybe 10, 12 years or something like that. And he just needed to do something else with his life. And maybe, the whole, he wanted to get off the touring sort of grind for a while and just explore some other things. But you know what I mean? I don't think he had any animosity toward anyone in the band. He was still on good terms with everybody. I mean, I met a couple of the Iron Maiden guys while we were there. We borrowed a snare drum from Nico, and I met Dave Murray at one point, and he was a lovely fellow. Bruce just wanted to try some things and just try some other styles and, just write some more music and just do some things that... Now, if you look at the Skunkworks record, for instance, most of the lyrics on it are not lyrics that you would expect on an Iron Maiden record, I think, for the most part. His lyrics were kind of, it was just all over the place, really. He had a chance to try different things, and we even, distorted his voice on a song. I said, let's give your voice that sort of radio thing. I don't remember what song it was, but it was just that was obviously the thing to do, and you would never do that on a Maiden record, actually. So it just gave him a chance to stretch out. The funny thing, there was a record that never came out. He did some sessions with Keith Olsen before he worked with me. And Keith Olsen's a very famous and very established record producer. And he never let me hear any of it. But I gathered that there was something a little more electronic about some of it. But I think ultimately he just decided that wasn't the right direction for him, and nothing came of it. I never got to hear any of it. He just sort of mentioned it to me. I guess, he got along fine with Keith, but it was just like an experiment. And then I was the next experiment, and we actually made an actual record that got released. So Bruce was stretching. He needed to just, needed to get some stuff out of his system, actually, during the 90s, and he did. And ultimately, his solo stuff started converging more and more back toward the sound of Iron Maiden. Of course, when him and Adrian Smith are in the band, it was kind of like, well, this is almost half of Iron Maiden here. I got to give it to him. He always, none of those records were casually made.
So, Jack, what was it like working with Bruce Dickinson as a producer? How did that all come together?
It's a strange story that most people don't know, actually. I was recording a band I think it was 1994. They were called Curb Dog. They're from Ireland. They're from Kilkenny. Wonderful people. And they were signed to Phonogram UK, and their management was Sanctuary Management, which was, of course, Iron Maiden's and Bruce Dickinson's solo management company. After I did that record for Phonogram, it's a pretty heavy record, actually, the Curb Dog album. Unfortunately, for whatever reason, it didn't really make much of a splash. But Bruce heard it, and, he was about to make his, third record of his solo career at that time. And he liked what he heard, and, I got a phone call one morning here in Seattle from Bruce Dickinson of formerly of Iron Maiden, which was pretty amusing. And, he just called me directly, and we talked. And it was interesting because we realized we were kind of close to the same age. I think maybe I'm 6 months older than he is, something like that. And I think we probably had very similar record collections, which was part of the whole thing, when we were talking about old Jethro Tull albums and Deep Purple and whatnot. He's a big Deep Purple fan. We probably grew up listening to a lot of the same music, so it was pretty interesting, really. So that started off the conversation of, okay, you want to make a solo record, and it became apparent to me that he'd been listening to a lot of the stuff that had been coming out of Seattle in the last, several years. A fair bit of which I had been involved with, at least in the early days. Bruce he's pretty in touch. I mean, he listens to stuff. He keeps track of what's going on. And he wanted to make a solo record that didn't sound explicitly so much like Iron Maiden. He wanted a modern, hard rock, heavy record. And I said, well, you've got the voice. If you've got songs, I can do this, Of course, I grew up listening to some Iron Maiden records as well as, everything else. But, that was the mission, to make a record that didn't sound like Iron Maiden, but was still, a heavy rock record that showcased that voice. And I still remember the first time I got into the studio, and it was time to record his vocals. And, we put him on a U87, which is what he told me was the mic for him. And, he started singing, and I just looked at my assistant and went, there it is. there it is. There's the voice. Here it is right now, So, yeah, Bruce is definitely one of a kind. So anyway, yeah, the Curb Dog record led to me recording what became the Bruce Dickinson Skunkworks record.
So when he just called you out of the blue like that, how surprising was it, especially considering you'd never spoken to each other before?
I might have been warned by somebody, but I think it was fairly surprising. I don't remember. This was like 30 years ago, so it's hard for me to remember the specifics, really. I might have gotten wind of it from my management company or something. But, it was interesting because, I'd known some of the people that were running the management company. Mercuriadis actually was the guy handling Bruce Dickinson for Sanctuary at that time. And I think later he ended up running, when Sanctuary turned into a record label, which is another story that I think someone else will have to tell. Merc ended up, I think, moving to the U.S. and running Sanctuary's record label operations here. But anyway, Merc was the guy that I was dealing with for Curb Dog, and he became the guy I was dealing with for Bruce. So, when I went back over to England, it was like, here's all the same guys in the management company. We'd go down and hang out at the management office and shoot the shit. And it was interesting, actually.
That's cool.
Yeah, Sanctuary was an interesting operation at that time. They were kind of a property acquisition company they were becoming. They had like rehearsal spaces. I don't know if they actually had a studio. They had a rehearsal space with some recording gear. They seemed to have all sorts of weird business interests. Anyway, none of that is my department, really. My task was to make a record. So I took several trips to the UK. I think it took a total of 3 or 4 trips over there during the summer of 95. First, I went over there just to meet Bruce and the band members that he had found. His band that he was going to use were some new young guys. And so we spent some time doing some kind of pre-production, getting to know each other and listening to some demos and so forth. And then I went back over and we did some more pre-production. I don't remember if it was 3 or 4 different trips over there, but it seemed to take, over the course of about 4 months of my life, there were several trips to the UK and back. And we finally ended up tracking at a studio in Milton Keynes called Great Linford Manor, which was a classic UK residential studio built in a giant old manor house that was technically a historical building, so they couldn't modify the building structure too much to make a studio out of it. But there was an old EMI Neve console, beautiful old piece of work, and a big ballroom that we used to record the drums in. And, of course, the Marshall factory is in Milton Keynes. I may be saying that wrong. Possibly if I was English, I would say Milton Keynes, but I don't actually know how it's pronounced. My apologies to anyone from the UK here if I'm butchering the pronunciation. I think it's Milton Keynes. Anyway, yeah, we went to the Marshall factory and we borrowed a couple of amps. And, the guy who ran the studio, his name was Pete Winkleman. He was a charming fellow, rather eccentric, as one would imagine anybody running a residential UK studio would be. Very much in a similar vein to Kingsley at Rockfield, which was where I had recorded Curb Dog the year before. So the UK residential studio thing is pretty classic. They feed you, you got a place to sleep, you get up early in the morning, you go take a walk in the countryside, come back at noon and the band is just getting out of bed, and you have your breakfast or lunch or whatever, and then everybody records, and then they go down to the pub for a drink afterwards. It's an idyllic way to record a record, actually, because there's no distractions, actually. And we would just have to wait for Bruce would come in from London, and me and the band were basically marooned out there at the studio. So, we'd just work on guitar all day or whatever. That was a good time. Important to point out the record Skunkworks, and now I didn't know this until we were in the progress of making the record, because Bruce's concept was he wanted it to be a band, and he wanted the band to have a name. He didn't want it to be the third Bruce Dickinson solo record. Of course, he ended up getting talked out of that by the record label sooner or later. But his concept was to have a band, and he was going to call the band Skunkworks. And the album was going to be called Skunkworks, self-titled. And Bruce, as you may know, is a pilot. And he's into airplanes, and you get him talking, and it's really interesting. He knows the history, and he's kind of a plane geek. He wanted to name it after this place called the Skunkworks, which was a Lockheed R&D facility, very top secret, where they had developed the original U-2 spy plane and the SR-71 stealth bomber, and I think a lot of other crazy, what was very, very advanced technology in its day. It's funny, I think he had actually had a chance to visit the place, he told me. I could possibly be remembering this wrong because it's been 30 years, but I think he was able to get a tour of the place because by the time the 90s rolled around, I don't think it was quite so secretive anymore. Bruce, as you may know, is a pilot. And he's into airplanes, and you get him talking, and it's really interesting. He knows the history, and he's kind of a plane geek. Bruce took me for a ride in his airplane. I think it was one day he said, "Oh, it's a lovely day for flying. Would you like to come and And I think it was a Piper Apache. I could be wrong because I don't know planes that well, but it was a small plane, like a 2-seater or something like that, maybe 4-seater. And we took a trip from London to somewhere near Milton Keynes, and it was because we would do like a week or two at the studio, and then we'd take a few days off and go back to London and maybe go to a show or something. I remember going to see Motorhead with the band members at one point, which was amusing and very, 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 very loud. But so we flew to Milton Keynes, and I remember Bruce pointing out the window and going, "See that field down there?" And he points down, and it's like a pasture. It's green. And I go, "Yeah." And he goes, "That's where we're landing." It was actually a grass landing strip. It was a little small regional private airport with literally a grass landing strip. It was a pasture, and I guess they would go out with some sort of roller thing and just flatten it occasionally. And he landed on this grass landing strip. And then we went in, and there was this little old English lodge, and there was like these, guys in there sitting at a bar, having a little polite drink, and everybody go, "Oh, yeah, Bruce, how you doing?" But yes, he's a lovely pilot, and that might have been my first time in a very small plane.
Did he ever do any kind of tricks with the plane when you guys were up there?
Oh, no. He's not. It was just me and Bruce, actually, that time. The band, of course, they were already out there, I think. No, Bruce wouldn't do that. He wouldn't do any hot dogging. That's not... He's much too professional for that. He's not going to do anything stupid.
Well, that's awesome. I mean, I don't know how many people can say they took a private flight with one of the biggest singers in rock.
It was one of those moments like, punk rock brought me here. There was another time. I was in Mexico standing on top of this pyramid I don't remember the name of it. Anyway, never mind. Disregard that. It's another story. But there have been moments like that over the years where I've been like, wow, music brought me here. What the hell am I doing in this place? That was a moment. Yeah, Bruce is a lovely guy. We got along great. He was very professional, and, when it was time to work, he worked.
So, Jack, what exactly was the issue with the record label?
There were strange issues with... I wasn't privy to this exactly, but I remember after we finished the record, I had a call from Bruce, or maybe it was while we were finishing the mixes. He intimated to me that there was some question about which record label was actually going to release it. The record label that was going to release it was having some business problems. And, I don't remember if it was Castle or CMC or who ended up putting the record out, but it ended up being someone other than who was originally going to put it out. There was some ambiguity with the record label situation, and ultimately, the record came out. It got no promotion in the United States, so nobody here in the U.S. seems to have ever even known that I made the record. I think it did better in South America because Bruce had very, very popular in Brazil. And, I don't know. It's basically, it was a typical record label misfire where the business plans went awry. The original record label went under, something that I'm not quite sure what happened. So the record it sort of sneaked out there, and I think the Iron Maiden fans were a little baffled by it. And the other people that maybe he was aiming at, he was trying to get an audience of people other than just Iron Maiden fans. And because of the record label situation, it didn't really get promoted and nobody heard about the record. So I hear more about the record now, 25 years later than I did all through the 90s after that record came out, because it kind of went out and just disappeared. It was like I went to England and disappeared from Seattle for 4 months, and there was not much evidence that I had actually done anything. So I'm kind of cheered that there's a certain sort of It seems like it's like a
Reliable.
kind of a cult record now. I mean, it's like I hear from people occasionally now. They're like, "Yeah, that Skunkworks record. What's up with that?" So some people get it.
What does this album mean to you?
It was a really interesting time. It was kind of a big experiment for Bruce and for me. Ultimately, I don't think it did that much for his career or mine because, at the time, I'm not, partly because of that whole record label confusion that happened right when it was about to come out, and partly because I think it was, because of that, I don't think it was promoted very well. And also the only people who heard about it because of that were Maiden fans. And Maiden fans want to hear Bruce sounding like Maiden, which was not what that record was. So, at the time, it was a little kind of ambiguous what impact it had. It wasn't clear to me. And back here in the States, most people never heard that I even made the record, so it made no impact on my career, plus or minus, because nobody ever heard it. Even to this day, people have no idea that I made this record because, it came out on basically an indie label in the United States. And I think I only have one copy of it, actually. So, it was I was paid well and I got to spend a lot of time, much of an entire summer in the UK, which was delightful. I spent a lot of time in the British Museum on my days off and, some time, a lot of time walking around in the country or in Milton Keynes. There's a canal there that actually has a beautiful walking path that goes for miles and miles and miles. And I swear I must have walked like 15 or 20 miles on this walking path early in the mornings before sessions. I was in really good shape by the time I finished that record from all the walking I did because I got up way earlier than the other guys did. So it was a really fun time. I enjoyed it. It was hard work. And like I said, I don't know if it did much for either of our careers, but the record stands and it was mission accomplished. I made the record that we set out to make. And Bruce went on with his career, and so did I. So it was sort of a strange time, a little unique, actually. It was another one of those interesting adventures that I had in the 90s. At one point I was flying in the plane. The Skunkworks band, without Bruce, Alex and Alessandro and Chris, had a side project called Sack Trick, which was kind of a somewhat less serious band who were kind of genius nonetheless. I have to give some props to Sack Trick here. They had a couple of recordings there's like 2 or 3 Sack Trick albums. They're very weird, they're pretty funny, and they're kind of genius. I think I have a guest vocal spot on one song where I recite some line and I don't remember what it was. They're all great players. They were really good, and they wrote most of the music on the Skunkworks record. Bruce came up with lyrics and melodies, and I was with them most of the time when they were arranging the songs. I would be the guy going, let's chop a few bars out here, don't bore us, get to the chorus. Why are we doing 16 parts here when it would be better with 8? I'm the chainsaw guy with song arrangements. I try to keep things from getting repetitive, you know what I mean? Very, very sensitive to this with hard rock where people take a riff and they just, beat it into the ground when it would be more interesting if you leave people wanting to hear it again. It was a good and interesting time, actually, making this record for Bruce, because we kind of did. I mean, it was mission accomplished. We made the record exactly the record he wanted to make, a modern sounding, 90s hard rock record that didn't sound explicitly like Iron Maiden, and it showcased his voice very well. And I also, lyrically, he rose to the occasion. There's no dragons and sorcery or any of that sort of stuff on there. It's a very, he had a lot of topics that he wanted to look into, and it's a pretty interesting record and doesn't really sound like anything else in his catalog. We had an interesting scenario that happened. I actually, I wasn't sure where to mix it. We were tracking at Great Linford Manor, which wasn't really set up optimally to be a mixing studio. It was better for tracking. And I ended up at a place, I thought I was going to mix at a place called Mayfair. And I got a couple days into it and realized that the control room, just the speakers or something just wasn't working for me. So we had to it was kind of a scenario. I had to somehow extract myself from that situation and find another room that was more working with my ears. But they worked out some kind of deal with Mayfair. Bruce ended up later going back and doing a bunch of demos there, and everybody was happy. And I ultimately ended up at a studio called Lansdowne. I don't know if it's still there, but it was a lovely studio in London that had been kind of under the radar, and apparently it had been there for a long, long time. And they had a beautiful Neve console, perfect room, very private. That's where the mixing ultimately started happening. Now, something very regrettable happened. I started mixing Bruce's record and immediately got sick. And I got sicker and sicker, and by the third or fourth day of mixing, I could barely hear anything. I was going through boxes of Kleenex, classic bad head cold thing where you're just like the sore throat, you're just gushing, your nose is, you're just like, oh, you're just miserable. And, I'm like, oh, I'm trying desperately to mix, and I'm like, I can't hear a damn thing. And the mixes are getting worse and worse. And, I did what I could, flew home, and, a week or two later, Bruce and I talked on the phone, and he said, look, I know exactly what just happened because the first couple mixes you did are great, and then they get worse and worse. And I said, I know, I couldn't hear a thing. And he says, look, it's totally fine. Let's just pay to fly you back over here, and you can just mix the whole thing again. And I said, this is great. So a month later, I flew back and remixed the whole thing from scratch, and it was exactly, minus the freaking, head congestion, and it worked out perfectly. And that was the record that ended up coming out, which I think it's been deluxe reissued a couple of times. There were a lot of bonus tracks we did and some B-sides, as well as some of the things that he went back and recorded at Mayfair later for demos. There's some very funny stuff. There's a song called I'm in a Band with an Italian Drummer, which I didn't record actually, but in fact, Alessandro, the drummer, is very Italian, and he's quite a character. And they were all characters, actually. I did have a chance to play soccer with the band at one point.
Really?
I ended up as the goalie because I'm not really very good at anything else. And and I do have a little picture somewhere of Bruce with his fencing sword because he actually he was actually a serious, for sport kind of fencing, where you have that screen that you wear over your face, and there's rules and it's very formalized, and he sort of did that.
So if he doesn't like your producing, does he attack you with the fencing sword?
No, he didn't have that. He wasn't waving that around in the studio. He brought it one time just to show me, actually. It was cute. Because I think I asked him, actually, because he'd won some championship or something. I mean, he was actually, competitive.
Really?
I think I could be exaggerating, but there was something formal about it that he was, taking it seriously. It wasn't just like a casual thing. It's like, it's like the airplane thing. I mean, that wasn't a casual thing for him. He's flying, I don't know, what was Iron Maiden's airplane? It was like a Boeing 707 or some giant thing. He was flying that thing. So, this is not a guy who just does things casually. If he's going to do it, he does it full on.
How is he at soccer?
Fine. I mean, I'm again being a Yank. I'm not. We're not very good soccer players over here. I don't think, for the most part. I mean, because it's all about. It's soccer. When I was in school, it's like we just didn't do it.
So what was the vibe like working with Bruce and the band?
Here's the thing is they kind of thought I was insane because I'm used to working 10-hour days in Seattle. Still to this day, I'll start at noon and I'll go until 10 p.m. at night. And that doesn't really fly with these guys. I mean, they'll have a leisurely lunch and roll in around 1 o'clock and then have a fairly leisurely dinner, and then maybe we do some more guitar at night, and then by, 9 o'clock or whatever, it's time to go to the pub. Instead of my 12-hour days, we might have an 8-hour work day, which, that's humane. If you're going to do day after day in the studio, you burn out pretty quick if you do those kind of long work days too many days in a row. I couldn't do the insane hours. I mean, if they got tired, I would continue working on other things or taking notes or, editing or whatever I needed to do, cutting tape, because that's how you edit things before digital. You would cut tape with razor blades, and I'm very familiar with that. I came up doing that stuff. And you know what? As far as I remember, most of the record is not on a click track. I think there's a few songs where we used a click track, but most of it is not, which made it especially crucial to get the right performances. Which we did for the most part. I'm satisfied with the record. The UK residential studio thing is pretty classic. I mean, they feed you, you got a place to sleep, you get up early in the morning, you go take a walk in the countryside, come back at noon and the band is just getting out of bed. you know, and you have your breakfast or lunch or whatever, and then everybody records, and then they go down to the pub for a drink afterwards. It's an idyllic way to record a record, actually, because there's no distractions, actually, you know. And we would just have to wait for, you know, Bruce would come in from London, and me and the band were basically marooned out there at the studio. So, you know, we'd just work on guitar all day or whatever. That was a good time. The interesting thing is, if you talk to Bruce for a while, which I did at great length, you know, you find out what his influences are, and he's not ashamed to say that he's a big Ian Gillan fan. And if you go back and listen to the early Deep Purple records, and then you listen to some of the Iron Maiden stuff, you sort of go, oh yeah, there's that thing he does with his voice. And you know he's a big fan of Arthur Brown. And Arthur Brown is pretty obscure now, but at least here in the U.S., he's fairly obscure. But he had a band called The Crazy World of Arthur Brown, who probably made a bigger splash in the UK at the time than they did here. But there was one single called Fire, which still gets some airplay on oldies radio sometimes. You'd have to look it up. I think Arthur Brown lives in Texas now. But, and he had a very crazy kind of dramatic delivery, and this was like around 1970, 71. And Bruce is a huge fan of Arthur Brown. And I went back and listened to the record, and I thought, oh yeah, okay, there it is. There's another influence. And he's also a big fan of Ian Anderson. He loves Jethro Tull, you know, and just a lot of those old records that I grew up with. You know, Bruce is like, you know, he gets his influences from everywhere. But Ian Gillan is a big one for him. Metal has got a thing to it, and once you figure out, you know, there's certain conventions in the style that are, you know, you just know what it is and you know what to do. And when people tell you that they want to sound like this or that, I mean, you know, my generation grew up listening to all the 70s hard rock records that, you know, the young metal bands now all look back on, you know, the classic UFO records and Thin Lizzy and AC/DC and Zeppelin and Deep Purple and blah, blah, blah. You know, I've made a lot of different records in a lot of different styles, punk, garage, metal, psych, whatever. The grunge thing was just part of it. So making a heavy rock record for Bruce Dickinson was just like, yeah, I'm all over this. It was fun. It was satisfying. It was hard work, but it was, you know, and I sort of felt a little responsibility, if you will. It's like, you know, don't fuck this up. This is fucking Bruce here. It's the boss.